Croeso and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 221, The People's Charter. We've spent most of this season talking in depth about the problems that were plaguing Wales and Britain, but these troubles were slowly spreading across all of Europe. It wasn't just an English thing, or a Welsh thing, or even a British thing. As industry and political ideas spread, the defeat of Napoleon did not stop the questions that were raised through his defeat. Questions about the people, about who should be in charge. Democracy, human rights, and fairness over autocracy were driving a lot of the questioning of the old established order. Europe in the late 1830s and 40s was a cauldron where ideas that affect the modern world blossomed. Communism, democracy, universal suffrage, socialism, and care for the poor were not just a nebulous religious ideal. Ultimately, the revolutions of 1848 would light the fires which would destroy much of the old order. As Britain's industry rose, so too did industrial-sized problems. Rapid urbanization into massive industrial cities created a number of medical, social, and planning issues that would cause problems that were needing innovative solutions from a conservative society. Not conservative as in political, but conservative as in careful, unwilling to change, not driven to change. They weren't really prepared for these consequences. This was something that drove political and economic philosophers such as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels to write things like the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Modernity, for all its convenience and normality today, was a shock to those living through it. While market economies with no checks created a great deal of societal imbalance. For people from the old school, this was seen as a horror show, as a loss of something better. The pastoral, feudalistic life was gone, and in its place, the new normal was being driven by new wealth and new problems. The struggle is seen in the ideas of the so-called peaceful life, getting away from the rat race of urban life that modern people believe in. We still see the rural lifestyle in some ways as an idealistic place where you perceive things to be slower, calmer, more peaceful, something that is driven by a complete lack of understanding of how those societies used to obtain things. And because of this idealism, many in this era would come to paint this agricultural, rural lifestyle in this light, something we carry on to today. Going from the smoke-choked, crowded streets where illness and disease and destitute people lurked around every corner, you can kind of see why this was an allure to those who were unable to leave those kind of places, or that they longed for those kind of places. But few farmers in the centuries before enjoyed an idealistic existence. Much of the struggle against nature and against your local lord and government was constantly measured in difficulties. If you did not have droughts, crop failures, or floods, you might have had militaries marching around, stealing your food, impressing anyone who could carry a gun or a sword into those militaries. By no means was life better or actually more ideal. It was just a different form of poverty and misery. The idea of having a relaxing home where you returned to in the country, where you had no responsibilities and could live this idyllic, peaceful lifestyle, did not really exist unless you were wealthy. It would be something that would develop in the minds of people eventually and be carried out to some degree by the middle class, but this was not that time yet. So, with that in mind, let us have a look at those who found themselves largely on the outside, who were trying to change the system. They were reformers, radicals, and those on the outside who began to agitate for something better for themselves and for the general community. The origins of Chartism began after the failed reform of 1832 and the failure of the Poor Law to address fairness and to deal with the poor in a way that was kind and was considered to be of equal perceptions of importance. Those kind of things started to drive people to action, and while the Reform Act itself had made inroads in extending the right to vote to a small additional group, it was not enough for many, and the actions of the Whig government only appeared to alienate those who were not in those favored classes, and this, of course, was exasperated by the introduction of the Poor Law Amendment in 1834. So you had this combination of things that was going on, and being poor was never easy, but it really was a disaster in these circumstances. Meanwhile, Wales was growing quickly, and urbanization had picked up tremendously in this period. For example, the little sleepy village near the edge of the Bristol Channel suddenly exploded in population. Cardiff, in 1801, had a population of 1,870, far from the bustling capital city of today of a few 100,000. This small, tiny community paled in comparison to Merthyr or Swansea or Carmarthen, let alone the mighty Bristol across the Channel. As coal and iron started to flood down the valley, so too did opportunity. Cardiff grew in the immediate aftermath to 6,187 by 1836. This was as the canals started to roll and we had railway starting to be developed. It was this year that the Taff Vale Railway Company was set up by Act of Parliament to take advantage of the industrial might of the valleys, and it was because of the valleys that Cardiff continued to grow. Within 20 years, the town exploded, and its population became 18,351 by 1851. In another 50 years, it would pass 100,000. This was the consequence of the flood of people out of rural life, moving into places like Cardiff, Merthyr, Carmarthen, Wrexham, and Swansea. Because these were located in key positions that allowed them to grow into powerful influences, either because of their access to the sea or the access to resources. As they grew, so too did the lower class working populations who became the lifeblood of these towns. As mentioned before, there was a great deal of dissatisfaction growing in Wales and elsewhere in the UK over how little the government represented the poor and working classes. There were active movements fighting against this inequality as reform movements called for better treatment across the nation. The election reforms and poor laws of the 1830s did not represent how many thought they should be in society. While some were disappointed, there were also a lot that were quite angry. In 1836, William Lovett, Francis Place, and Henry Hetherington established the London Workingmen's Association. This association was an appeal to skilled workers rather than the mass of unskilled factory laborers, and it was here that the seeds for Chartism was born, because these groups had the time and education to understand how they were being treated, and had the organization to make it something of an issue. In 1838, Lovett and Place, two self-educated radicals, in consultation with other members of the association, created what was called the People's Charter. This is where we get the term Chartism from. The charter had 6 basic demands. All men had the right to vote. In other words, all adult male suffrage. Voting should take place by secret ballot, something that was not done, which of course could influence how elections were created and voted. Parliamentary elections should happen every year and not once every 5 years. Not something that we've actually applied, let's be fair. Constituencies should be of equal size. So in other words, a constituency in London should be the same as a constituency in rural Wales. Members of Parliament should be paid. Apparently this was something that was not done properly before that. And the property qualifications for becoming a member of Parliament should be abolished, which is part of how they could create MPs that would represent the lower classes, because big part of the problem when you don't have property, especially property that has to be of a certain size, means that it eliminates most of the population in this era. Chartists demanded votes for all men over the age of 21. Some wanted votes for women, but it was felt that this would make the movement a laughing stock, as this was seen in 1838 to be an unrealistic demand. They also wanted annual elections to ensure that MPs were instantly answerable to their constituencies, something that was also realistically wildly unrealistic. We have a form of this that is applied in some places called recall, where people can recall you, but I don't know. There may be a democracy out there that votes every year, but to my knowledge, I don't believe there is. They also wanted boundaries to the parliamentary constituencies redrawn so that each seat would have equal population. So in other words, there wouldn't be a massive difference between a small constituency in London, which represented 50,000 people, and an area in Wales, which might represent 500, something that had been an issue in the past. Look at the idea of rotten boroughs as an example. Secret voting was asked for to ensure that people could not be victimized for voting for their favorite candidate and to prevent voting being bought, as was happening in the past. The Chartists wanted a sudden change which amounted to a political revolution at a time when those in the higher places were not really prepared for it. With it written up and agreed upon, the various members voted to send out what they called missionaries to spread the idea and the charter. They also created the Chartist newspaper, the Northern Star, to appeal to a society which was increasingly literate. Many of the Chartist demands were familiar, as radical groups had advocated for these causes for a number of decades, but none had produced such a complete package of reforms before, and often these groups were ridiculed by those in power. Chartist missionary Henry Vincent reached South Wales carrying a message like a true believer. He was a compelling public speaker and someone who also published newspapers. In this example, the Western Vindicator was kind of the Welsh Chartism newsprint, which gave news of the movement and especially of Vincent's travels and meetings across Wales. The charismatic Henry Vincent, who was at the forefront of this campaign, as you can imagine, in quotes, when he was invited to speak in Pontypridd, well over 1,000 people packed the ground behind John Llewellyn's beer house, end quote. Part of his appeal was his appearance, which apparently was quite striking, which was said to be a favorite of miners and ironworkers' wives and daughters in South Wales. In other words, they were saying he was really, really handsome. They were very active, and many female political societies supported the cause in the Gwent Valleys. Now, I suspect this is a lot of stretching of the argument because we don't have a lot of women's voices talking about this, so we don't know whether that's the official reason or if the fact he's just very eloquent and was able to win them over. If they were talking about female suffrage, you can see why that would be attractive to people who don't have any rights in society, basically. So you can see why that would be a good argument and not just the fact that the boy was hot, if that's the argument that they're making today. London also sent the founder Henry Hetherington as a missionary to Mid Wales as they continued to spread across the country. Surprisingly, these English ideals found strong adherents in Wales. The working class, which had become increasingly dissatisfied, found something they could seize on as a club against those absent lords and rich owners who dominated their economic lives. A part of the Chartist efforts was the development of working men's associations. These local groups were key in developing more and more Chartist members in Wales. The first one established was in Carmarthen in 1837, the year before the People's Charter was even written. Its support came from hat makers and tinplate workers of the town whose industries were declining, and they found these arguments of representation attractive because they felt like their voice was not being heard and their issues and their financial woes were being ignored. Industries that were on the decline in this period were especially favorable seedbeds for these arguments. Workers in the declining woolen industry, for example, in mid Wales, in towns like Llanidloes, Lladnir, and Newton, were ready to hear the ideas of the Charter. However, Most support still came from the ironworkers and colliers in South Wales, and many of these workers thought these reforms would allow them to control Parliament, to pass legislation to improve their working conditions, and to remove the poor laws which they objected to. The People's Charter was later published in Welsh, increasing the movement's appeal to the Welsh-speaking areas, something that was an absolute necessity, as most Wales was still predominantly Welsh only, even in communities like Merthyr, where there was an increasing amount of English language only people moving to the town/city. There was a drive still for a lot of Welsh speakers. Chartists grew in numbers through 1838, and by October, protests and demonstrations were being talked about. It would be in Newton, Montgomeryshire, where the first great Chartist demonstrations in Wales were held on October 10th. Thomas Powell, a personal friend of Hugh Williams and Henry Hetherington, led the demonstrations. Powell was described by the local media as, quote, a fiery little Welshman who had much of a rebel in him, albeit a sensible man, clever and wary, end quote. Economic issues all throughout this period in Wales, from depression, firings, wage reductions, plagued South Wales and fanned the flames of revolt and protest. Further branches of the Workmen's Association, or WMA, were founded in Newton, Llandudno, Welshpool, and other places on the model of the Birmingham Political Union. This had a lot of influence on these areas, and delegates from Birmingham actually went to Newton to explain the principles of Chartism, and among the speakers was Charles Jones. Jones was chosen as a delegate to the Chartist National Convention and was considered to be very well versed in what it was they were doing. In Glamorgan, the center of Chartism was Merthyr Tydfil, which of course comes as no surprise considering its position in the area economy and its importance as a population center at that time. It was, of course, the largest town in Wales, with a population of 34,977 in 1841. It had a long radical tradition, as we well know in the podcast. The flames of the Merthyr Rising were still in the minds of many. It had not been a decade since that incident. The Merthyr branch of the Working Men's Association was formed in October of 1838, where Morgan Williams, described by Jones as a small entrepreneur, was its secretary and leading spokesman at the time. By the end of 1838, several WMA branches were founded across Monmouthshire. The first was in Pontypool, probably in 1837, and it was towards the end of July 1838 that a branch was formed in Newport. Its founders were Baker, William Edwards, and veteran radical and printer Samuel Etheridge. Soon afterwards, the drapers and magistrate John Frost joined the meetings, and these men were key to what happened over the next year in Newport. In Monmouthshire, about 20 new branches were claimed to have been opened, and by February 1839, it was claimed that they represented 25,000 members. Meanwhile, back in London, things kept progressing. The Charter was creating a unifying message for a desperate element of the community, the poor laborers and the skilled tradespeople, and because of this coherent singular message, it reached everybody. This was a movement united by tangible concerns about political representation and economic improvement, as highlighted by such men as Speaker Joseph Rayner Stevens, when he described Chartism as, quote, a knife and fork, a bread and cheese question, end quote. Or, as a political advocate once told me one time, people care about the car in their driveway and the jingle in their jeans. After launching the People's Charter, the movement organized the National Convention, which we mentioned earlier, to be held in London, emulating the structure of Parliament by referring to delegates as MCs, or members of convention. In the end, Chartists were able to secure 1.3 million signatures to present to the House of Commons. This was to be a petition to request that the Charter be honored. Unfortunately, it fell on deaf ears, as the Commons and MPs voted not to hear the petitioners by a majority. The presentation of this petition to the Commons on the 12th of July, 1839, was the beginning of a series of consequences which would set off and drive both the working poor and the powers that be into a conflict, one that would become very much a powder keg, especially in light of what was perceived as a unwillingness to listen. Little did anyone know how this would affect the small Welsh community of Newport, as it became the epicenter for the biggest uprising against the government in Wales, basically for probably hundreds of years almost. Certainly since at least possibly the English Revolution, and certainly becomes a massive influence on Wales today even. But we're going to get into that next time when we talk about the Newport Rising. Thank you for everyone for listening. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com or at Welsh History Pod on Twitter or facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And if you would consider to helping the podcast out, you can do so via Patreon at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you all for listening or watching, as this will go up on our YouTube channel at some point. And I hope you have a wonderful day. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.